back and reevaluating. But it's a great, I think it's a great positive thing because it allows for us to get decisions out quickly. The claims examiners love them because it's easy, because they can just write the decision, because it's just, if you get this and this and this, it's an approval. That approval then feeds right into your e-approval generally. Okay, so those are easy cases to get out the door. So the SEC process, I think, has been a great benefit for a lot of folks. And we try to make it as convenient as possible for the folks to get through the process where we do most of the screening and we reopen the cases automatically on our own authority. The only thing that I can just ask for folks is just to understand that when these gigantic SECs hit, the first thing we get is calls saying, where's my acceptance? Where's my money? And you have to understand that a population that big, they are going to screen them and they're going to start writing those decisions as soon as that circular gets published. But it's not only going to happen overnight.
But we also do have timeliness standards, not only in our operational plan, but in our standards for our claims examiners, so that they have a window, especially for these cases. Once they're screened, they have a very short period of time to get them accepted. In addition, even though we do have that whole prior process for circulars, at the end of the day, we normally get that circular published within a day or two of
right.
the actual effective day once it's gone effective into it. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, and even if the circular has not been published,
we're still screening them before.
We're still having the district office, as soon as that pool list comes out of our case management system, it gets transmitted, and that can happen way before the circular gets issued. And basically what they begin doing is pulling all those cases and putting them in a special queue for evaluation. And in fact, they actually begin looking at those cases so that they're in a better position to know exactly how they're going to disposition those cases once the circular is actually issued. Okay? So I think it's been working fairly well, and I know that a lot of folks are happy with that SEC process, and I know that there are some sites that folks are working through petition issues, and again, that's not something we're going to involve ourselves with. All we are interested in is administering the cases once that designation has gone through the process and has been officially sanctioned by NIOSH. Okay. Switching topics, moving on to something else. The issue with the toxic substance exposure, I was asked to talk a little bit about our process. I have a separate slide we'll talk about the site exposure matrices. Under Part E, as many of you know, we do a lot of work with regard to exposure and toxicity and health effects and that sort of stuff. How many people have looked and learned about how awesome our site exposure matrices is? Everybody had an opportunity to look at that. Okay, that is a resource that the Department of Labor has put together. Okay, it's not perfect. It is a job aid. It is something that is continually being evaluated. Okay, and I think as part of Rachel's Q&A, we're going to be talking a little bit about the Institute of Medicine that's taking an analysis, is undergoing a study of our site exposure matrices and how that works, and alternative things that we might be considering as part of our exposure development process. Generally for the exposure component, what I like to talk about is what you can do to help, okay, through this process. Okay, just as a really quick background, when we do development of our Part E cases, what we're looking for is as much information as we can about a particular employee's exposure background. Okay, when you come into our program, you file a claim, and what is a claim? You're saying, I'm alleging something. Okay. It's up to the claimant ultimately to prove that that allegation is true or convinces me that it's accurate. Okay? These are some of the things that we try to utilize in assessing that evidence. Okay? So we will ask that claimant, that survivor, that employee, whoever it is, we're going to ask them, what do you know? What do you know about what the employee did, where they worked, what they came into contact with, the processes they were involved with, any information that you think is relevant. We'll ask about the personal protective equipment kind of questions, and all this information. The most important thing that I can tell you, and I'll keep reiterating this throughout the day, is claims examiners examine evidence, okay? Written evidence, okay? If it's in your head and not on a piece of paper, it does the claim no good, okay? The number one thing I can tell folks that are advocating or representing folks is make sure that they provide as much information as possible. The more information, the better, because when we construct the cases and are going through our evaluation of cases, we look at all of the information and try to piece together a case. And you'll hear us talk about the totality of evidence, because oftentimes we're working with very shabby, vague kind of information, and we've got to make these sort of logical leaps as to does this make sense given all these disparate pieces of information. More information is generally good when it comes to developing toxic substance exposure information. Same thing with DOE document acquisition requests, okay? This is where we go to the Department of Energy and say, what do you got? Give us what you got, okay? Whether that's exposure records, radiological dosimetry records, medical records, employment records, or whatever they've got in their possession, okay? And we get that back. And Greg can tell you, some of those can be huge volumes of information, okay? The one thing that I will caution some of you is, and it might have been something that Greg talked about, is that we get all the information from the Department of Energy. Turning right around and then sending a FOIA to Greg saying, can you please release all the employment information that they're supplying to us, is basically a waste of resources. They're going to give us everything they've got. Unless you've got some bead on some information in some uniquely strange place, asking DOE for the records that they're giving us is sort of a waste. Because we do get it all. Okay, so we do get a lot of information. Right, Greg? Mm-hmm. So don't ask twice for the same stuff. So we do get a lot of information, and you can get access to this record. It's all going to become part of the case record. So if you have a question about what information that is in the case record, you can request copies of the case file. For the site exposure matrices, this is a big one because there's a lot of misconceptions about what the site exposure matrix is and how it's used. It is nothing more than a job aid that we utilize in trying to assess the exposure history of a particular employee. Okay? I know there was someone in here that wrote me a letter or wrote us a letter recently about, how do you use the site exposure matrices? And you can use them in a lot of different ways, and it can do a lot of different things. Okay? But what you have to be very careful with when you're using the site exposure matrices is that it's a decision, it's a database of information that can lend itself to helping adjudicate a case and making a decision. Okay? And we see it as something that as a tool is very helpful in a lot of instances where there's information that is available, okay? Where the information doesn't exist and it's not only site exposure matrices, we've got to then look at these other things and see if there's something in any of these other records that might help us. Okay, so the one big thing that I think about the site exposure matrices is people look at it and tend not to understand that when you go in there and say, let me see all the exposures that occurred at Savannah River that are linked to COPD, okay? That does not mean that that particular employee encountered every single one of those particular toxic substances, okay? We have filters that we utilize to try to come down to a convincing number of exposures that that employee could have come into contact with. So you can filter by job title, job process, building, location, area, all these things. We are trying to whittle down the exposures to the point where we have a convincing set of exposures that this employee likely came into contact with that we can then evaluate in our causation assessment. Okay? But if you want to, you can go out there and say, I know that there were thousands of toxins that are linked to COPD at Savannah River. My employee was exposed to them all. Don't forget, this is a claim. You've got to convince me. How do you know that? Show me. How do you convince me that that's true? So the site exposure matrix is great, and I think it's a great resource, but it's a resource that has issues in the fact that it's not a complete representation of everything that we know about every toxin out there. Okay? It also provides a lot of information about health effects, which is these toxins are linked scientifically as causing or having a health effect for COPD. These toxins have a health effect that can contribute or cause or be related to lung cancer. Okay, and all these other things out there. The big complaint, of course, is that, hey, I've got this illness that I know is caused by X substance. Why isn't it in the site exposure matrices? Okay, well, because maybe the science isn't as good as you think it is, or maybe there's not a lot of information that shows that that's a convincing finding. In other words, there's lots of science out there, and I'm not a scientist, okay, like I said before. There's all kinds of people that are scientists that we try to work with to make those kinds of calls and decisions, okay? When we are confident that there is a known linkage between a particular toxin and a health effect, it's going to go into the site exposure matrices, okay? Now, that being said, I know a lot of you are sitting there saying, yeah, John, what about I heard diabetes? What about this? What about that? That's information that you supply in supporting your claim. It might not be in the site exposure matrices, but that doesn't mean it might be successful in getting that claim approved. It's just that we don't have the ability to put it in here because of the criteria we utilize in putting in information on causation and health effects in site exposure matrices. And we accept a lot of claims that don't have exposure and causation issues addressed in the site exposure matrices. Okay? trying my best to sell the site exposure matrices. Claimant records, and that's where it's just like anything else. Anything in your possession that you're going to come to us with, okay? And a few things that I'm just going to caution you on with regard to claimant records. The more the better when it comes to exposure. If you're giving us good, solid exposure information, okay, that is always helpful. With regard to health effect issues, okay, we're going to be looking for scientific data and studies that show relationship, okay? A lot of people will present with information that they think makes the case, but it doesn't really, from a scientific standpoint. And given my novice understanding of science, I'm going to give you an explanation. Things like material data safety sheets, people send these in and say, look, I was told to stay away from hydrochloric acid. This caused my breathing problem, okay? Or this substance is really bad, stay away from it. Or this substance is really bad because it's, we don't know, but we think it's bad. Material data safety sheets are just that. They're basically saying, we're not sure, this is potentially dangerous, let's limit exposure to this. It's not saying this causes this disease, exposure to this causes that disease, okay? The other thing that people do is send us stuff that is really not scientifically very good. The funny example I always say is, you can't send us something from Dr. Fungus showing us that this causes this particular thing, which did happen in one particular case, okay? It was just a website. Somebody pulled up something, and there was some guy on there that was, selling something about some fungal infectious thing, and they used that to support the claim. That has really no scientific merit. Just because you find something on the internet doesn't mean that that necessarily carries a lot of scientific probative value. Okay, so just be cautious with that kind of stuff. You can certainly submit it, and we'll certainly look at it, but it's not going to be something that's probably going to convince us of the accuracy of the health effect of that disease to a particular toxin. Okay. The site exposure matrices, which I was talking about, a lot of this, I think Rachel's going to touch on the IOM, the IOM studies being done right now, but we are constantly adding to the site exposure matrices. We have constant additions being put in for exposures. We are also looking at additional health effects that are out there. We operate through HAZMAP, so a lot of the information flowing from HAZMAP gets incorporated into site exposure matrices. So we're constantly updating it. Okay, it's a continual process. And we are having a study done. It's a contracted study that is going to be looking at the SEM disease links to see if they are really scientifically valid. Are there alternative data sources that we can look to find health effects that are out there? Any kind of like other kinds of sources of health effect data. Evaluate the usefulness of HAZMAP, because HAZMAP and SEM are linked. The information in HAZMAP flows into the site exposure matrices. Our expected completion is March or June. It's sometime March, June 2013. So, and Rachel can talk a little bit more about that. I don't know who it was. Somebody was asking me about treating physician versus our DMC, CMCs. And here I can take a few minutes to talk a little bit about this. When we're talking about causation, what we're talking about is the Part E standard, where we're talking about a significant factor in causing, contributing, and aggravating an illness. Okay, that is a medical question. All right, a lot of people confuse exposure and causation as being strictly medical. It's not really. Exposure is more of a scientific question. It's did you factually come into contact with this, and do we have an inkling that that exposure can contribute or be somehow linked to a particular illness? When it comes to actually establishing the Part E causation threshold for compensability, there are three ways it can occur. A presumptive policy directive, where we say something like, you were exposed to benzene for a certain period of time and you have leukemia, that leukemia is accepted as a work-related illness. Okay? And we have certain illnesses that are out there like that. As soon as you meet certain criteria, we will accept your case. Okay?
Is that the matrices that are?
It's not the matrix. There's certain bulletins or circulars that list and identify. I know benzene and leukemia. We have.
They're in certain bulletins.
They're in certain bulletins.
It's not the matrix you're referring to.
No, it's not that. Okay. And what we're doing, we're talking about causation, establishing causation.